There's more work happening here.
Yeah, it's still harder.
Yeah.
I'm small and fragile. Hi everyone, welcome to Munro Live. Jordan Arocha here, and we've got Kevin Hardy. Today, we're going to be talking about small overlap rigid barrier. So if you've been keeping up with the news on the Rivian side, you'll note that the Rivian just got tested by IIHS in small overlap rigid barrier, which, if you're not familiar with that, is one of the most difficult tests to achieve high score ratings on that they conduct. So they do moderate overlap, they do full frontal, they do oblique side pull. There's many tests that IIHS will conduct and produce scores for different OEMs. So they're a Highway Institute entity, right? So it's not government, it's not paid for by the OEMs, it's actually an insurance institute. So that score, Top Safety Pick Plus, is what the R1T received, is what many consumers and OEMs sort of reference as the benchmark in terms of safety. And so today we just kind of wanted to give a response to that score. So first of all, kudos to Rivian for getting that. It is a difficult score to achieve, especially with a vehicle of this mass, meaning total weight, and we can elaborate as to why that is. But we want to talk about a little bit the different architectural elements that we saw that we believe are enabling that good score. So with that being said, Kevin, maybe if you want to start out at the front of the vehicle and kind of give some insight as to why we think they achieved a good score.
Yeah, sure. So when you kind of look, and if you kind of like aim down and kind of look with the camera this way, you can see essentially there's a suite of structural layers that the Rivian has. Jordan and I were talking earlier that we think that, from the hinge pillar forward, if a lot of this wasn't here, the Rivian has enough structure that it probably would do well in a relatively defensive, scenario, which essentially there isn't a lot of the structure forward of the wheel envelope or the wheel axle itself, and then the cab of the vehicle is taking the brunt of the hit, given just how much like sectional area and reinforcement that they do have. But coming forward from that, their upper load beam is pretty significant in size. It has very smooth load paths going up the A-pillar itself and even going down into the hinge pillar. You can actually see where we kind of cut aside the section itself. And then when you look through even just the overall material thickness itself, it's pretty substantial. So they do have a very large upper load beam coming down and running into a stanchion off the frame rail itself. Also, the shock tower is, Jordan, I would say, very unconventional for a pickup truck. It is much more akin to a automobile. It's very deep drawn. It's a series of layers. So there's a lot of material here and also a series of fasteners that run at joining the shock tower and the frame itself to the upper body. But as we kind of come through here, it comes down to this stanchion, and then we have this entire extruded mass off to the side of the rail itself here, which helps engage the primary load structure of the vehicle itself, which is also splayed, and you might be able to see that if you kind of look down. So all those aspects are huge enablers in small overlap, because what makes these crash events so horrific is essentially they bypass most of the primary load structure, where here, as you can kind of see, we have these angles converging at this point. Rivian's done a pretty good job of trying to get their primary load structure to complement each other in this zone for moderate and small overlap itself.
Yeah, so Kevin, maybe just before we continue, you may have picked up on a few things that Kevin said. So he said defensive. So when we look at SORB events, typically we categorize those results or how a vehicle performs in two different ways, offensive and defensive. So what we mean by that is defensive, essentially, as the vehicle goes through the event and starts to engage with the barrier, most of the impact structure, a lot of the structure that's protecting the occupant home where the occupants sit, is aft of like the center line of axle, roughly. And what they get from that is a very rigid occupant home. And so they're allowing much more deformation or intrusion of the barrier towards the occupant home or the dash panel. And then once they get here, they're really holding firm structurally. And the vehicle sort of hangs up here. And what you'll see oftentimes is later on in the event, maybe 120 milliseconds or so, you'll see the vehicle kind of stop and start to pivot away from the barrier, depending on, of course, which side you're running the test on. Now, so that's defensive. You kind of end up with this more perpendicular final resting place of the vehicle relative to the barrier, versus offensive, which I would say the Rivian definitely leans more in the offensive package
I would agree.
strategy. You'll see exactly what they did. So starting from the very, very front, you've got a pretty significant in the 3mm range plate on the leading edge of the bumper beam, which is a multi-piece stamped steel, clamshell welded reinforced member that goes into that 25% zone. So SAE J1100 spec is how they measure the total vehicle's width. They take 25% of that, and that is where the rigid or the barrier will be aligned relative to the vehicle. And so they're putting a lot of this structure in that same zone relative to the vehicle's width. As they move rearward, as Kevin had mentioned, they've got this extruded tower that gets sort of sandwiched in between the outer surface of the vehicle and the primary load rail. These two working in harmony together, as soon as the vehicle, almost before the wheel even makes contact with the barrier, they're using those two structures to drive loads into these crosscar beams right here in the primary rail to start the movement laterally of the vehicle away from the barrier. So in essence, the offensive strategy is trying to deflect off of the barrier, whereas the defensive strategy is trying to defend against major intrusion once you get to the occupant home. And you might say, well, doesn't everyone try and defend the occupant home and try and keep this area safe? Yes, absolutely. But the offensive strategy definitely, and you can even see it from like a plan view or a top view down on the Rivian, you'll see it, and I think they did an excellent job, at when the vehicle starts to engage with the barrier, there's not a lot of rotation of the vehicle, but more of like a lateral slide away from the barrier. We typically would say that is a positive reaction because of secondary impacts. So you can imagine you get into a small overlap rigid barrier event, a SORB event, you glance off the barrier, a vehicle's driving behind you, doesn't have enough time to brake or swerve out of the way, they collide with you. It's much better to take a direct rear end impact than an oblique or sort of like a T-bone scenario. So we would consider that a positive trait to have. So kudos again to Rivian for doing that.
Yeah, it does overall very well. It almost skips completely off the barrier. One thing we did notice while looking at the video is that it kind of hangs up right around the door. And it's actually a very deliberate moment. These are very fast and violent crash events, but as it comes into the barrier, hits, and it comes, and as it makes its way through, granted, they did driver's side, and this is the passenger side of the vehicle that we have sectioned here, but it comes through, and then right around where the hinges mate, you start to see essentially the leading edge of the door flatten out, and this is something which we consider a pretty good vehicle in this segment, the XC90 as far as small overlap is concerned, where it hits the barrier and kind of keeps going very well. It does something similar where it flattens the door out and you see the whole door shift kind of rearward past the B-pillar. But on the Rivian, it gets kind of hung up here. And you can see, there's a substantial amount of structure here. And it may be something that they didn't plan for. Unfortunately, sometimes this sort of thing happens where they were hoping to get enough lateral movement off the barrier where it wouldn't get hung up. It did get hung up. It doesn't necessarily hurt anything, but it did start the vehicle to rotate a little bit in a perpendicular fashion versus just kind of skipping or glancing off the barrier, which it definitely seemed like it was on track to do prior to getting hung up on the door itself. But overall, it did very well, and that's kind of what we saw when we first saw this. We kind of joked about seeing the impact script itself and kind of wondering what it would do, and we assumed it would do well. It did do well. They've put a lot of time, money, and material and effort, into this strategy, which is, I would say, the only downside to a more offensive-oriented strategy is, this is something, a lot of mass and weight that lives up here that hopefully you as a customer never has to use versus a defensive strategy. But I think they've done a pretty good job, integrating it into a structure that you get to use as a customer the entire time. So.
Yeah, and I think they did a good job, to your point, Kevin, at protecting the occupants and achieving a top safety pick plus in terms of the score. However, I would say they threw a lot of mass at this vehicle.
Yeah.
And we always say weight begets weight.
Yep.
And so part of the thing with SORB that's so difficult to achieve good scores and design around, the heavier the vehicle, the harder it is to achieve a good score. So if you have let's say an F-350, so a heavy duty truck, a truck that is often used in commercial applications, solid axle, giant fully boxed frame, the vehicle weighs over 7,000 pounds. Normally we would say, regardless of the scores, mass kind of wins in a event in the real world. In the SORB event, the mass or the size and the structure of the vehicle actually can play against you because it's fighting itself. So essentially, as the vehicle is going towards the barrier, it's got so much inertia and momentum going towards that barrier, there's not enough structure, or it's very difficult to achieve enough structure so as to deflect and get that vehicle changing its vector, essentially, to move away from that barrier. And so if I were to look at another vehicle that is of a much lighter curb weight, think of a Volvo XC90. If you watch that, the results are very similar in that it sort of just skids past the barrier, but they did so with significantly less structural material, weight, whatever you want to slot in there. But instead of this giant extrusion, which if you can't tell, I mean, it's roughly the size of, you know, a small soccer ball, for example. The equivalent version of this on the XC90, I could fit in the palm of my hand. And they had a small deflection piece that was on the back side of the bumper beam that, once fully deformed, would engage with the side of the bumper beam, just like this is intended or designed to do, but they achieved the same results largely because they're not fighting 7,000 pounds plus of vehicle mass. Granted, it was not a BEV, right? So you're not carrying a battery pack, but just in general, when we're talking about BEVs, these are the things that we're trying to design around. People will ask, what is the difficulty in terms of designing around BEVs, especially with regard to safety? If you take the thermal event component aside, right, because that's a hurdle, obviously, and you just look at impact, really, the mass is what we're fighting.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of the suppliers that we had talked to, you know, prior with the ICE, you know, vehicles, trying to get as much weight as possible out to get their efficiency up. Now, in some ways, body structures have gone a different route, trying to bring mass back in to counteract the weight of the batteries for some of these crash events. It's kind of a, ultimately, I think you'll start lightweighting them as well to get as we understand more about those overall systems and how they work together. But it's an interesting turn of events, if you will, where we were pushing to hyper-efficient, lightweight body structures, and a lot of money spent in buying weight. But now, in some ways, we're adding mass and section back in because of just the sheer mass of the batteries and trying to hit certain range targets and things of that nature.
Yeah. So I guess overall, I would say, again, in terms of all things impact related, the fact that they achieved Top Safety Pick Plus, and the way they did it, meaning mostly offensive, the final end state of the vehicle in terms of positionally where it ended up relative to the barrier. All those things considered, I would say kudos to Rivian in terms of achieving a good result. Yeah. If I were to give my Munro score relative to the execution and the architecture and the amount of mass they had to add into the vehicle to do it, I'll just say this: I would hope to see the vehicle a little bit more optimized in the future from a mass perspective. But for your first vehicle out of the gate, literally ever as a company, you're going to be conservative, and with conservatism in areas like this, you're going to add mass. In some cases, you're going to add cost or both. Yep. So it's to be expected to a certain extent, I would say. Yeah. No,
absolutely. And obviously, you know, a vehicle that's designed solely for lean design and designed for manufacturing is different than one that has a whole series of various performance objectives. So yeah, it's a constant battle. So
indeed. Well, I hope you enjoyed the quick summary, or at least our feedback on how the R1T did. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Detroit Denim. In Detroit, you can go and find them. They make some really awesome products, great jeans. They're a sponsor of Munro, so just wanted to give a shout out and say thank you. And then also, if you are interested in seeing how much this R1T costs, these reports, so we actually cost and tear down this whole vehicle, those reports are now live for purchase. And so if you want to head out to sales@leandesign.com, you can get in touch with someone about that if that interests you. So thank you again. Have a great day.